The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Ridge when Elizabeth Carson stepped off the westbound stage, her heart heavy with secrets and her carpetbag clutched tight against her chest. 3 years had passed since she'd fled this frontier town in disgrace, and now she'd returned under an assumed name, carrying documents that could either save her or destroy her completely. She'd barely taken 10 steps toward the boarding house when a shrill voice cut through the morning air like a rusty blade. "You there, strange woman?" Elizabeth turned to see a stern-faced woman in an expensive purple dress marching toward her, flanked by 2 other ladies whose pinched expressions suggested they'd tasted something bitter for breakfast. The woman's elaborate hat sat askew on her graying head, and her eyes blazed with the righteous fury of someone who'd appointed herself judge and jury of everything within her sight. "I am Mrs. Cordelia Pemberton, head of the Cedar Ridge Ladies Improvement Society," the woman announced, as if Elizabeth should genuflect at the mere mention of her name. "And you, miss, are in violation of our community standards by arriving unannounced and unescorted." Elizabeth straightened her spine, drawing on 3 years of hard-won strength. "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but I wasn't aware that arriving by date public transportation required anyone's permission." Mrs. Pemberton's face flushed an alarming shade of red. "Don't you take that tone with me, young lady. I'll have you know that this town has standards and we don't tolerate questionable women setting up residence without proper references." Before Elizabeth could respond, a familiar voice spoke from behind her. "Now, Mrs. Pemberton, that's no way to welcome a visitor to our town." Elizabeth's blood turned to ice water. In her veins, she turned slowly, knowing what she'd see, but hoping against hope that 3 years in distance had somehow changed the sound of that voice. But there he stood, Deputy Sheriff Daniel McKenna, his badge gleaming silver on his chest, his dark eyes filled with the same warmth that had once promised her forever. "Daniel," she breathed, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be a stranger named Catherine Mills. His eyes widened with shock and something else, something that looked dangerously like hope. "Elizabeth, but they said you were ... Dad," she finished quietly. That was the idea. Mrs. Pemberton's head swiveled between them like a hawk sensing prey. "You two know each other? How scandalous." "I demand an explanation immediately." Daniel stepped protectively closer to Elizabeth, his presence as steady and reassuring as she remembered. "Mrs. Pemberton, I suggest you tend to your own affairs. Miss ... Mills is welcome in Cedar Ridge, same as anyone else." "Miss Mills, indeed." Mrs. Pemberton's voice rose to a screech. "I happen to know for a fact that this woman is using a false identity. I have it on good authority that she's been passing herself off under various names across 3 territories." Elizabeth felt the world tilt around her. How could this woman possibly know that? She'd been so careful, so thorough in covering her tracks. Furthermore, Mrs. Pemberton continued, pulling a crumpled piece of paper from her reticule, "I have here a warrant for her arrest on charges of fraud and theft. She owes substantial debts to merchants in Abilene, Denver, and San Francisco." Daniel's expression hardened as he examined the paper. Elizabeth watched his face change, saw the moment when doubt crept in to poison the joy of their reunion. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "is this true?" The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire. Elizabeth looked into the eyes of the man she'd loved more than her own life, the man she'd left to protect from the scandal that had destroyed her family, and felt her heart break all over again. "It's complicated," she whispered. "Complicated." Mrs. Pemberton shrieked. "That's what they all say. Sheriff McKenna, I demand you arrest this criminal immediately." "Ma'am," Daniel said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge, "I'm a deputy sheriff, not a sheriff. And even if I were, I'd need to verify these charges before taking any action, and verify them. Send a telegram. I'm sure the authorities in those cities will be very interested to know where this charlatan has been hiding." Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of 3 years of running and hiding settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She'd known this day would come eventually, had known that the past would catch up with her. But she'd hoped foolishly, desperately hoped that she could make things right first. "Daniel," she said softly, Could we speak privately, please? Before he could answer, Mrs. Pemberton inserted herself between them. Absolutely not. This woman is a fugitive from justice, and I won't have her corrupting our upstanding lawman with her lies and feminine wiles. Mrs. Pemberton, Daniel said, his patience clearly wearing thin, you're not the law in this town. I represent the moral authority of this community. The woman replied hotly, and I say this. This person should be locked up immediately. Just then, a young man in a Western Union uniform came running up the street, a telegram clutched in his hand. Deputy McKenna, got an urgent wire for you? Daniel took the telegram and read it quickly, his face growing pale. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop as his eyes found hers again, this time filled with a pain that cut her deeper than any blade. According to this, he said quietly, Catherine Mills is wanted for embezzling $5,000 from a bank in San Francisco. Elizabeth Carson is listed as an accomplice who disappeared 3 years ago. Mrs. Pemberton clapped her hands together in triumph. I told you so. Arrest her immediately. Elizabeth felt the curious eyes of gathering townspeople boring into her. Word traveled fast in a small town, and already she could see faces appearing in windows and doorways, drawn by the commotion. There's more, Daniel continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It says here that Elizabeth Carson was believed dead after a fire at the Riverside Hotel in Sacramento. Her body was never found, but her personal effects were recovered from the rubble, 'cause I left them there, Elizabeth said, her voice steady, despite the tears threatening to fall. I had to disappear, Daniel. Had to let everyone believe I was dead. Why? The single word carried 3 years of pain and unanswered questions. Elizabeth looked around at the crowd that had gathered. At Mrs. Pemberton's triumphant face, at Daniel's badge that gleamed like an accusation in the morning sun. This wasn't how she'd planned to tell him the truth, because she said, her voice breaking, because I loved you too much to let my family's sins destroy your future. Mrs. Pemberton snorted derisively. How convenient. Tragic love story to excuse criminal behavior. But Daniel's eyes never left Elizabeth's face. What sins? Your father was the most respected banker in the territory before he died. He was murdered, Elizabeth corrected, by men who discovered that he'd been stealing from his own bank for years to cover gambling debts. The $5,000 they say I stole? I took it back from the men who killed him, trying to return it to the people my father had robbed. But they framed me for the original theft, and I had to run before they killed me too. The street had gone quiet, except for Mrs. Pemberton's sharp intake of breath. Daniel studied Elizabeth's face as if trying to read the truth written in her eyes. The fire at the hotel, he said slowly. You said it. I paid a woman to help me stage my death. I thought if everyone believed I was gone, you'd be safe from the scandal. You could keep your job, build the life you deserved without being dragged down by association with a criminal's daughter. So you let me grieve for you, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. For 3 years I mourned you. I visited your grave every Sunday, left flowers, talked to a headstone that covered an empty coffin. Elizabeth's tears fell freely now. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Thought it was for the best. Mrs. Pemberton stepped forward, her face flushed with vindictive pleasure. A touching story, but it doesn't change the fact that she's a wanted criminal. Deputy McKenna, do your duty. Daniel looked at the warrant again, then at Elizabeth, then at the crowd of townspeople who were hanging on every word. Elizabeth could see him wrestling with his duty as a lawman and his love for her, and she couldn't bear to watch him make that impossible choice. You're right, she said, pulling her wrists together. Arrest me, Daniel. I won't run anymore. But before Daniel could move, an elderly man pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with concern. Hold on there, deputy, said old Pete from the general store. I think there's more to this story than meets the eye. Mrs. Pemberton whirled on him. Mr. Peterson, this is not your concern. I think it is, Pete replied calmly. You see, I remember when Miss Elizabeth's father died. A tragic thing. But I also remember the bank examiner who came through afterward, a fellow named Harrison, had some very interesting things to say about the investigation. What kind of things? Daniel asked. Pete scratched his grizzled chin. Oh, he said the evidence against old Carson was mighty convenient. Too convenient. Like maybe someone had set the whole thing up to take the fall for their own thievery. Mrs. Pemberton's face had gone from red to an alarming shade of white. That's ridiculous speculation. Is it? Pete's eyes fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. Funny thing about that bank examiner, Harrison. He mentioned that the real thief was probably someone with access to the books, someone trusted by the community. Someone like, I don't know, the head of the Ladies' Improvement Society who organized all the church fundraisers that went through Carson's bank. The crowd murmured with interest, and Elizabeth saw Mrs. Pemberton take an involuntary step backward. How dare you? Sputtered. I am a pillar of this community.
A what?
Cordelia? The new voice belonged to Martha Chen, the saloon keeper's wife, who had pushed through the crowd carrying a worn leather ledger. Never forge deposit slips? Never alter withdrawal records? Never convince a grieving widower to sign papers he couldn't read because his eyesight was failing? Mrs. Pemberton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. You see, Martha continued, my late husband kept very careful records of all his business dealings, including the ones with your husband before he died, Cordelia. The ones where you convinced him to invest his savings in a guaranteed mining venture that never existed. Elizabeth watched in amazement as the woman who had been so quick to condemn her began to crumble before their eyes. This is preposterous, Mrs. Pemberton shrieked. You're all in league together. This is a conspiracy. The only conspiracy, said a new voice, was the one to frame an innocent man for your crimes. Everyone turned to see a distinguished gentleman in a city suit approaching, his badge identifying him as a federal marshal. Marshal Thompson, Daniel said, surprised. What brings you to Cedar Ridge? I've been tracking the real perpetrator of the Carson Bank fraud for 3 years, Thompson replied. Mrs. Pemberton, you're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. As the marshal read the charges, Mrs. Pemberton's facade finally collapsed entirely. She pointed a shaking finger at Elizabeth. She's the one you want. She, ma'am, the marshal said calmly. Miss Carson was trying to return stolen funds to their rightful owners when she was forced to flee for her life. The men who killed her father were hired by you to eliminate anyone who might discover your scheme. Elizabeth felt her knees go weak with relief and disbelief. After 3 years of running, hiding, living under assumed names, and constantly looking over her shoulder, the truth was finally coming to light as Mrs. Pemberton was led. Away in handcuffs, still protesting her innocence, the crowd began to disperse. But Elizabeth found herself standing alone with Daniel in the middle of the dusty street, 3 years of separation and pain stretching between them like a chasm. You could have told me, he said quietly. You could have trusted me to help you. Elizabeth looked down at her hands, work-worn from 3 years of taking whatever job she could find while staying one step ahead of bounty hunters. I was 20 years old, Daniel. My whole world had collapsed overnight. My father was dead, our name was destroyed, and I was facing a hangman's noose for crimes I didn't commit. I wasn't thinking clearly about anything except keeping you safe. Safe. From what? From loving you? From standing by you? The pain in his voice was almost more than she could bear. From having your career destroyed by association with me? From watching everyone you'd grown up with turn their backs on you? From having to choose between your duty and your heart every single day? Daniel stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of his soap, see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. And what about my heart? He asked softly. What about the fact that I would have chosen you over everything else, without a moment's hesitation? What about the fact that losing you nearly destroyed me? Elizabeth's tears. You started falling again. I thought I was protecting you. I thought if you believed I was dead, you could move on, find someone else, build a happy life. There was never going to be anyone else, Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. There hasn't been anyone else for 3 years. How could there be, when my heart was buried in that empty grave on the hill? Before Elizabeth could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A group of rough-looking men rode into town, their eyes scanning the crowd with predatory interest. Elizabeth's blood ran cold as she recognized the leader, Jake Morrison, one of the men who had killed her father. "Well, well," Morrison called out as his gang dismounted. "Looks like our little bird has finally come home to roost." Daniel's hand moved instinctively to his gun, but Morrison's men already had theirs drawn. "Easy there, deputy," Morrison said with a cold smile. "We're not here for trouble. We're here for what's ours." "And what exactly do you think is yours?" Daniel asked, his voice steady, despite being outnumbered 5-1. "Hey, the money that little Elizabeth there stole from us 3 years ago," Morrison replied. $5,000 plus interest? We've been very patient, but our patience has run out. Elizabeth stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly. "That money never belonged to you. It was stolen from innocent people, and I returned every penny to the bank in Denver." Morrison's smile turned ugly. "Did you now? That's a shame, because we had plans for that money. I guess you'll just have to pay us back some other way." His meaning was clear, and Elizabeth felt Daniel tense beside her. The few remaining townspeople scattered, leaving them alone with Morrison's gang in the empty street. "Over my dead body," Daniel said quietly. "That can be arranged," Morrison replied, his hand moving toward his gun. But before anyone could draw, a shot rang out from the roof of the general store. One of Morrison's men cried out and stumbled, his weapon falling to the dust. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," called a voice from above. Elizabeth looked up to see old Pete with a rifle, his weathered hands steady as granite. More shots came from other buildings as the townspeople of Cedar Ridge revealed themselves, armed and ready to defend their own. Morrison looked around at the gun barrels pointing at him from every direction, his confident smirk fading fast. "This isn't over," he snarled, but he was already backing toward his horse. "Yes, it is," said Marshal Thompson, appearing at the end of the street with 2 more federal agents. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, robbery, and about a dozen other crimes." As Morrison and his gang were rounded up, Elizabeth found herself once again alone with Daniel. But this time, the space between them felt different, charged with possibility instead of weighted with despair. "So," Daniel said softly, "what happens now? Are you Catherine Mills, or are you Elizabeth Carson?" "I don't know," Elizabeth admitted. "I've been running for so long, I'm not sure who I am anymore." Daniel reached out and gently took her hands in his. "You're the woman I fell in love with 5 years ago. You're the woman I never stopped loving, even when I thought you were dead. You're brave and loyal and willing to sacrifice everything for the people you care about. That's who you are, no matter what name you use." Elizabeth looked into his eyes and saw her future reflected there, not the desperate flight she'd been living, but a real life filled with love and hope and the possibility of happiness. "I'm scared," she whispered. "What if people can't forgive what I've done? What if Daniel silenced her with a gentle kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise?" "Then we'll face it together," he said when they broke apart. "No more running, no more hiding, no more trying to protect me from choices that should be mine to make. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Elizabeth felt something inside her chest that had been frozen for 3 years finally begin to thaw around them. The town of Cedar Ridge buzzed with excitement as news of the arrest spread, but she only had eyes for Daniel. "Together," she agreed, and for the first time in 3 years. The word felt like a promise instead of an impossibility. 6 months later, Elizabeth stood in the Cedar Ridge church, wearing a simple white dress that Martha Chen had sewn for her, her hand in Daniel's as they spoke their vows before God and the entire town. Marshal Thompson had cleared her name completely, and the recovered money had been returned to the families who had lost their savings to her father's unwitting involvement. In Mrs. Pemberton's scheme, old Pete gave her away, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he placed her hand in Daniel's. The townspeople who had rallied to protect her had become her family. Proof that home isn't always where you're born, but where you're accepted and loved for who you truly are. As they kissed to seal their union, Elizabeth felt the last of her. Fear fall away. She was no longer Catherine Mills, the woman on the run. She was no longer Elizabeth Carson, the banker's disgraced daughter. She was Elizabeth McKenna, deputy sheriff's wife, beloved member of the Cedar Ridge community, and living proof that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the courage to come home. The evening sun painted the prairie sky in shades of rose and gold as they walked to their new house on the hill. Hand in hand, their love a testament to the truth that redemption is always possible when someone believes you're worth fighting for. And if sometimes Elizabeth still looked over her shoulder out of old habit, Daniel was always there to remind her that the only direction that mattered anymore was forward together, into whatever. In Cedar Ridge, they tell the story still of the woman who came back from the dead and the deputy who'd never stop believing in love's power to heal even the deepest wounds. It's a story about second chances and the courage to trust, about the difference between running away and running towards something better. Most of all, it's a story about coming home not to a place, but to the person who makes you whole.